Welcome to the episode 3 of Dear Global Leaders solo episode. So, for the first episode, I will try to find some sort of flow of what are the challenges when you go global. And the first episode, if you missed it, was about the scale and the strategy behind it. But the second one was the step right after the scale when you put your luggage on the countries and that you figured out, okay, I will have to adapt culturally to make this a success. And eventually, for you, successfully for you, you may have succeeded into your scale. And then the next question will be, how do I remain dominant in this new market? And today we will discuss based on a use case. Again, we could have taken a lot of different companies, but I decided to talk about Huawei and the 5G technology. As you may know, at some point in 2019, there were really big players. There were 40% of the global telecom was they were supplying of the market. 40% of the telecom market was supplied by Huawei and their 5G technology. So it was right before the COVID. And what was interesting with their case is that few months later, they were completely distrust and collapsing on because of some topics that we'll discuss today. So sometimes you can have the right level of standardization and adaptability and flexibility of your offer, and then yet you will get the challenge of regulation. And this is a big topic for a lot of us, especially in some market where sometimes the regulation change a lot. You may have a cycle business. And here with Huawei, they were really at the peak of their, in 2019, as I was saying, they were cheaper, they were faster, and they were ahead technologically of Europe and also of the US. But then, a few months later, a lot of new sanctions arose for them in linked to their business in Europe, in North America, but also a certain part of Asia. And so then they came from global dominance to global distrust. And now we'll analyze this, and this can be important for your business because you may have a global business in which different geographies and different countries or different regions have different regulation framework, and this impact directly your business. And we will discuss what was the description behind what happened for Huawei and what are the takeaways. As we all love numbers, I will just launch some of them. So in 2021, Huawei has invested, it was the biggest spender globally regarding innovation in the telecom. They really wanted to be the first pioneer with the 5G. They were really good in the rapid deployment and the low-cost equipment, and they invested $22 billion in R&D. And they were present across 170 countries. And in 2019, they were already having supplied 30% of the European market, including Germany and UK and all of the biggest markets. So they were really strong implemented, and they were really in the same position as McDonald's with the global scale, with the competition edge. And then the geopolitical backlash happened. And this is the first pillar of this business decrypt series for this episode. If you remember, and I took this case not for the political reason, but I took it because Huawei is a case that a lot of people heard about. When the sanctions started, it was alarm raised by UK and US, and of course the allies followed, that this beautiful technology that was the 5G might be used for spying, and Huawei might have had ties with Chinese government. So we'll not treat this topic at all during this podcast, but the idea was to say that some countries started, it was UK and US and Australia, I think, and then came other one. They started to put sanctions in 1920, 2019, 2020. And this had a really big impact on Huawei. And this was one of the big lessons that we can learn from this case, is that you can have the technology leadership, but in critical infrastructure business, such as telecommunication, or even any type actually of infrastructure such as water, or cybersecurity and all of these, or government linked business, it's really important to have the political trust. Technology leadership is not enough. And this is what Huawei unfortunately learned through this period. And right after, the sanction really had a consequences on the supply chain pressure. And this also had a lot of consequences on Huawei. So for the telecommunication and for Huawei business, they really needed to access semiconductor. And US decided to cut semiconductor access to Huawei. So another big pull was to go to Taiwan. And in Taiwan, one of the biggest company that supplies semiconductor is TSMC. And they also decided to not supply anymore Huawei because of this political mistrust that were potential. And this has huge consequences. So Huawei at that time had 20% global share and dropped to 5% global share, which is a huge drop, and they completely collapsed. And lastly, there were the European dilemma. So I mentioned that in Germany, they were highly dependent on Huawei. But because of the political association, they had to, it was complicated for them. It was not really efficient. They had a lot of like replacement costs and delays, but they had to find another supplier. And this will also be the case for another podcast. We may look at this because it's really important point. But all to say that it was the same with Germany with oil. Also, when the war with Ukraine happens, with the dependency of the supply chain in Russia. All to say that the pressure with supply chain really hurt Huawei at that time. Secondly, in the second pillar of this decrypt, I will look a bit more at the view on Huawei, but also about the strategic framework and what was the missteps. And here in the episode 2, we looked at some of the misstep in avoided to look at the admin and cultural elements. Here, Huawei did a lot of great stuff, but unfortunately, the part that were not really well covered was the admin and the political distance. They didn't consider the importance in such a critical infrastructure market to take into account the regulation frameworks and the laws, but also not just the customers, but also the impact of the government and the regulation, also the image of the brand and the company. So this is a really important point. And at the end, this also comes to the risk management lenses. And this is really important in strategy, and especially in sensitive industries, is that sometimes you figured out that you need to have a top product and a top quality and take care of a lot of parts, but in the end you will expose yourself to a non-market risks, and this will be the geopolitical part. So really critical here for Huawei, and this is a failure to whom we can learn a lot of lessons, but also the national security. And in the end, some customers make political choice when they discuss on brands, but when you're in a critical infrastructure, it's also the government, and the geopolitics is a really important element. And in the third pillar of analysis, we'll look at this topic of this institutional trusted element. And I will look at different competitors, and you will look that sometimes it's not the most the leader in technology that will be the winner. It's really the one that can comply with all of this regulation and laws. And at that time, Huawei lost market share in 11 EU countries. Usually EU countries are the front runner for the regulation. So I will look at this market. And while other competitors like Ericsson at the same time was a bit more slow, but gained trust and gained the contract, and in the end won big. This was the same for Nokia. They started to slowly roll up the 5G, and they came small contract, and they took their time, and they create a relationship with the government, and this won on the long term. It was a bit the same with Samsung and also brand. There were a lot of different landscape of competition, and they were gaining ground in certain countries because usually you don't want to have dependency over one brand. And this is what happened with Huawei in Germany. They figured out, okay, there will be delays because the supply chain was under pressure. There were some critical other elements that we discussed, and the government realized we cannot depend on one suppliers. And so the one that pops up at that time and could have this trusted element on the political side and on the security side could win some part of the market. So this was really also interesting from this analysis. What I love about the example of Huawei is that I'm first an engineer, so of course I love technology, I love innovation, I love to go bold and create this big strategy and big implementation. But you need to remember that it always exists a world where you can lose everything overnight if you do not take into account not the technology, not the business, but this political or institutional trust. So here are the three takeaways of this episode. So first, the growth of today is really mastering the geopolitical framework of different markets. The second one is that the leaders, they really need to incorporate in their business strategy the non-markets strategies and elements. And this is really about the Porter analysis. When you have the external element, it's usually about this geopolitical and regulation and those framework. And this sounds sometimes just something that we put as a checkbox, but actually using a brand and buying a brand is a political choice. So it's really important that we make sure that the offering will stay strong. And the last one is that actually scale is really fragile. If you do not have the legitimacy, it will become difficult. So I hope that this episode was enriching for you. And as always, if you found this one interesting or that you were working at Huawei in the past, please comment below. But also, if you had a similar experience as working on a project where regulation was really a challenge and that you could extract some learning, feel free to put it in the comments. And as always, if you want to support the podcast, really put some great rating and subscribe to the podcast. And I see you in the next episode. Bye.